As you know, 2020 was a pretty interesting and challenging year for us. We learned a lot, particularly as it relates to equity and addressing issues of social injustice within our community. Hopefully, some of those learnings will be evident as we describe and discuss this year's budget process and some of the ways that we are doing it in terms of it being the budget a little differently. It takes a village, so there's going to be a lot of people presenting at this first work session. You will hear about the future work sessions and the topics that will be discussed. And if we could, Beth, if you could bring up the presentation, I will start with just giving you an overview of what we hope to provide for you in terms of information. It is going to be a lot of information shared with you. However, we do have some places within the presentation where we're going to stop to see if you all have questions, but please feel free at any time to ask questions if you have any. As I said, it takes a village. We have several staff members who will be providing you with information, an overview of the budget 101, our current fiscal year status in terms of where we are with expenses and revenues, and then talk about next year's budget process. At that point, we will have some consultants who participated in our Reimagining Public Safety, as well as I believe staff from our Equity and Inclusion Department that will talk to you about the budget process. The employee compensation study will be presented by the assistant to the city manager, Peggy Rowe. And then we'll talk about summary and what the next steps are. Next slide, please. And so for the most part, the key takeaways, again, there's going to be a lot of information covered and presented in this presentation. But essentially, as I said, there were a lot of lessons learned. And during this dual crisis of racial justice and COVID-19 really gave us an opportunity to advance some things that we have been trying to do over the past couple of years. But I think with these two, what we think are opportunities, we wanted to accelerate some things. Economic uncertainty of the pandemic, continue building a stronger link between equity and decision-making, and integrate with ongoing community engagements opportunities. Next slide. So right now, I will turn it over to our interim Chief Financial Officer, Tony McDowell, to talk to you about the budget process, and staff will be taking over from here. So thank you, staff, and thank you for the opportunity, Council and Mayor. Tony.
Well, thank you, Deborah, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll be covering the next few slides, and then I'll turn it over to Taylor Floyd, our budget manager, and he'll walk you through some of the specific things we're doing this year around the budget and some of the stuff that we're really excited about in the budget office, some of the work that we're doing in conjunction with our consultants and the Office of Equity and Data Performance and CAPE. So, but just to start with, I wanted to quickly go over the calendar for this current budget cycle. As Deborah mentioned, feels like we just finished last year's budget, and in some ways we did. Last year's budget wrapped up, as you all remember, in September, a little later than normal. But we began this year's budget process internally, at least, with the start of our conversations back in November. So we've been working on the budget for a while now, for several months. And this is really our first opportunity to talk to City Council about where we are and where we're headed with the budget this year. As you can see from the schedule here, we have 3 council work sessions scheduled. The first one today, the second one is scheduled for March 23rd, and the final one is scheduled for April 13th. There's also going to be a city council retreat during that time as well, where the budget will be discussed further. And then we'll be bringing you the manager's proposed budget on May 25th, second meeting in May. And then coming back with a public hearing on the budget on June 8th and an additional work session if needed. And finally, adoption of the budget is slated for June 22nd of this year. And just a reminder that by state statute, we have to adopt a budget by the end of June in order to have that budget in place for the start of the new fiscal year on July 1st. Next slide. Okay, so just quickly, an overview of some of the upcoming topics that we're going to hope to cover with you all at the work sessions that we have in March and April. We're going to be focusing primarily today on the general fund. So when we come back to you all on March 23rd, we're going to talk more about the enterprise funds. We're also going to talk about our fees, in particular our water fees, on March 23rd. And then some of the other major operating issues that we may see with the budget coming up, in particular Fire Station 13 staffing. As you all may know, we're getting ready to start construction on that new fire station. And even though opening of the fire station is a little ways off, we'll need to go ahead and hire the staff midway through next year in order to have them trained and in place for the opening of the station. And then on April 13th, we will focus most of that work session around our capital improvement program. Next slide. So I wanted to just start with a quick kind of budget 101, just some reminders. And some of these slides are some of the same slides we shared with you all at council orientation back in January. But the first rule of budgeting, at least local government budgeting anyway, is that revenues have to equal expenditures. So unlike, let's say, for example, the federal government where they can do deficit spending, we're required by law here in North Carolina to adopt a balanced budget. So whatever expenditures we're anticipating in the upcoming year, we have to have revenues, an equal amount of revenues to support those expenditures. Next slide. So, but the budget's much more than that. It's much more than just the numbers. It's a framework for achieving goals, and an organization's financial health is essential to delivering quality services at a reasonable cost. And the budget is designed to reflect what an organization's priorities are and how we're going to fund those within our existing financial context. The budget, next slide. Budget's also a strategic plan. It lays out what the goals of the organization are, and it describes how we're going to fund some of those goals and values within the limited resources that we have. And unfortunately, as most local governments exist, and there's not enough money to fund all the things that we would want to do. And so we have to have a process that we go through that allows us to evaluate what the needs are and what the highest needs are, and then have a process for funding those through the budget process. Next slide. All right, I'll stop there before I get into some more of the details of the budget, just to see if there's any questions on the schedule or any of the things that we presented so far.
Tony, this is Kim. I just have one question. Typically, boards and commissions would have seen at some point capital improvement project drafts, operational drafts. Have any of the boards and commissions seen any budget analysis or presentation so far?
I'm not aware of anything that have been shared with boards and commissions so far. Deborah, I don't know if you've seen anything that's come through so far.
No, we haven't.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? I know it's pretty early in the presentation, so you all may have more as we roll on through these. Okay, so the next part of the presentation, we just want to talk a little bit about the current year budget status. And typically when we come to you all at your retreat, we do a financial update. And so that's kind of what the next few slides are designed to provide. And so I would say the takeaway from is that we have an improving outlook, but there is a lot of uncertainty remaining. If you all remember when we were doing the budget process last year, it was around this time that the pandemic first hit. And so we took a number of steps in order to balance this year's budget. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in the upcoming slides. Next slide. First of all, we want to start by just kind of reminding folks about what our resources look like and where they come from in the general fund. So the adopted budget for this current year in the general fund is about $135 million. But our two primary revenue sources, the revenue sources that provide the bulk of that, the resources for the general fund budget, are property taxes and sales taxes. Together, those combine for about $98 million, which is about 75% of our overall general fund revenues. And so again, those are really the two most important revenue sources that we have. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a couple slides. Next slide. On the expenditure side of the budget, again, $135 million budget, balanced budget for FY 2021. And I would say the takeaway from this slide, and we've talked to you all about this before, that we're a service-driven organization. Salary and wages and benefits, if you combine those two categories, and those are what we would call personnel costs, come up to about $80 million, which is about 60% of our overall general fund budget. And that's pretty common and it's standard across most local governments, that your general fund budget is mostly people heavy. It's a lot of our public safety expenses, our public works, our parks, and all those services are very much driven by people. Next slide. So just a quick reminder, like I said a couple of slides ago, we had to take some steps this year to balance the budget, because when we were putting together the budget, and we first started putting it together about a year ago this time, was when the pandemic hit. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, and we knew for sure that the economy was going to take a hit. So we took some steps with the current year budget, some cautious steps to make sure that we performed financially as best we could through a potential downturn. So a few things we did to balance this year's budget. We appropriated some fund balance, and you'll see in a couple of slides that number. But we typically only appropriate fund balance as a part of the budget to cover one-time expenses. But this year, because of the uncertainty around the pandemic, we appropriated some fund balance to balance the overall operating budget. Eliminated any employee raises for the current year, and we implemented a hiring freeze and held certain positions vacant and built the savings from that into the current year budget. We also kept operating budgets for departments flat. And what that meant was we took out any kind of inflationary increases for contracts that may have been going up in cost, or we were unable to add any additional money into our health insurance program to account for inflation there, or our OPEB or anything like that. We also didn't fund any new services or expansions in the current year. And through some of those steps, we were able to avoid some of the more drastic measures that other local governments across the country had to take. So, for example, we were able to avoid layoffs, furloughs, or any kind of visible service reductions to our community. Next slide. So how are we doing so far this year? So we've seen some positive signs in our revenues. I would say that the most positive thing we've seen, at least through the first part of the fiscal year, the first half of the fiscal year, is our sales taxes. They've been up 5.8% through the first 5 months of the year. And we were expecting sales taxes to be down. And the next slide, I'll show you some more detail on that. So the fact that they're up at this point is a positive sign. We've also seen higher growth in our property tax base than we originally estimated. We got the information from the Buncombe County Tax Office a few months ago about our current year tax base and what it looks like, and growth was higher than they had estimated last spring. And overall, our other general fund revenues are generally performing on budget right now. So just a little more detail on sales taxes. Again, sales taxes are one of our more significant general fund revenue sources. And just want to share this chart with you all, because when we started putting the budget together last spring, like I said, the pandemic was just starting, and we were really concerned about what was going to happen with our sales taxes. And so we were very conservative, very cautious in our budget. And you can see those dark blue lines are what we projected for sales tax revenue. And you can see in March, April, and May, we projected some fairly significant declines in sales taxes. And we did have declines, but in none of those months did the declines end up being as steep as we had thought they would be. For example, in April of 2020, we had estimated, like many other local governments in North Carolina, that we could be down by as much as 30% in sales taxes, but we're actually only down 19%. So even though that was bad, obviously, during those times, it wasn't as bad as we had thought it would be. And so then if you kind of fast forward to the July through November period, we had assumed, like most other local governments in North Carolina, that we would continue to see sales taxes declines as the pandemic was continuing. So we budgeted decreases in sales taxes in each of those first 5 months. But what's happened is we've actually seen growth in each of those months, attributed to the fact that here in North Carolina, at least, local governments are allowed to tax groceries. So, for example, even though folks have been spending less perhaps on services and entertainment and things like that, they've still been spending a fair amount on groceries and other essential items. And so our sales taxes have held up much better than we had projected. Next slide. On the expenditure side of the general fund budget, we've seen positive signs there as well. Overall, our expenses are trending in line with what we typically see for this time of year. As I mentioned, we held several positions vacant, froze those positions for this current year, and we've achieved the savings that we set aside for those positions. And we've actually also had higher savings than we had anticipated from other vacancies as well. So as you all may remember, back in December, we were able to utilize some of the savings from the current year along with the CARES Act funding and recognize our frontline and on-site employees with a one-time hazard pay bonus. And all that was done within budget. So just a quick look at the numbers in the general fund summary. So as I mentioned, we appropriated fund balance to balance this year's budget. That's that $1.6 million number you see on the left-hand column there. And so had we had our revenues and expenses stayed on budget this year, we would have ended up finishing the year with a fund balance of around 13.4%. And as you all may recall, we have an internal policy of maintaining a fund balance equal to 15%. So we would have been on track to come in a little under that. But we've done much better, especially on the revenue side through the first 5 months. And we think that's going to continue at least for the rest of this fiscal year, although there is still some uncertainty remaining. But right now, we're projecting that we will actually add about $2.8 million to our fund balance in the current year and finish the year slightly above our policy target of 15%. We'll be around 16 to 17%, which is where we've ended the year the last several years here in the general fund. So just a quick summary of where we're at current year. Revenue trending better than expected. The budget reductions that we made short term, we do need to make the personnel side at least through the end of this fiscal year, and
Tony, we're having some problems with you. Beth or Dan, we're having some problems with Tony's mic. Can you?
Hey, Tony, for now, turn off your camera, and that'll help with your bandwidth, and we'll send somebody from IT down.
All right. Do this too. Is that any better?
Just repeat that summary slide, please.
Is that any better?
No, it's not better.
Yeah, it's not an audio issue, it's a connection. So I think
Yeah,
turn off your cam.
yeah. Turn your video off.
Did that help at all?
Yep.
Okay.
That's
Okay, good. Sorry about that, people. The joys of virtually. So just in summary, revenue expected. So the short term or to balance this year's budget have helped in the short term, but we do recommend that we do manage expenses through the end of this fiscal year. There's a lot of uncertainty that remains about where we're headed with the pandemic and how strong the economic recovery may be and what additional federal stimulus. And Taylor Floyd, our budget manager, talked about that during his section of the presentation, which I think is coming next. Could answer the question slide. I'd be happy to answer any questions on the information that I've shared.
Tony, this is Gwen. How are we doing on collections around property taxes? I mean, I can't remember how we budgeted that, but how are we doing relative to collections, not growth at the base, but collections?
Yeah, we are from the tax collector, like under where they were last year. Significantly.
You're breaking up, Tony. Tony, we can't hear you. You're breaking up again.
We're obviously not spending enough in this budget on our Wi-Fi connection to City Hall, but.
Is that any better?
It's a little bit. Why don't you try
Okay.
a couple of sentences and we can.
Yeah, so if you want to hear me, so I have the tax collector, and things are a little down from where last year at the time, but not significant. So
Tony,
Tony,
no,
we can't hear you,
we
Tony.
can't hear you.
Go
So-
to Maggie's office.
Yeah, really. Taylor, you want to help?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at this one. I believe what Tony was trying to say is, we've touched base with the county tax collector, and they're seeing some decreased collection relative to last year, but I think overall it hasn't been extremely impactful so far. Hopefully, I got that right.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll go to
I have one
Taylor.
quick,
Stage. Okay.
I have one quick one. So back on the personnel and the benefits, I have a long-term question. So it looked like the benefits was about 30% of the total personnel. Does that number as a percentage of total personnel grow over time because of pensions, retirement, et cetera? Is there a rate that naturally occurs that I could apply? I mean, I know we're talking about comps and class studies and things. So because right now it's at 30/70. Does it go to 32/68 every year? Do we know any of that?
I'll take a stab at this one as well, assuming that Tony might still be a little staticky there. The short answer is yes, we see growth over time. Actually, it's one of the things I was going to talk about in a minute. Because we participate in the state retirement system, the employer contribution is set by a board actually that the state manages, and that percentage has gone up every year for the last at least 3, if not 4, and I think will continue to go up based on kind of the actuarial study that and work that they do in the treasurer's office. They manage the pension system, so that piece will continue to go up. The other significant benefit cost is healthcare, and that really I'll say I think over the last few years have been pretty lucky in our experience. Our claims experience hasn't drastically increased. I think a lot of other employers have seen that happen. So we've been able so far, knock on wood, again in the short, recent past, to keep that benefit, that cost pretty stable. But I think over sort of a medium to longer term, you would expect those to rise as healthcare costs continue to go up.
So great answer. Can you all hear me? This is Tony.
Yeah, much better, Tony.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm on my phone now while IT folks are working on my computer. So great answer, Taylor. Happy to answer any other questions you all may have. Sorry about the connection issues.
Okay, Taylor.
Well, this is Kim.
Oops,
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute. So can we go back to slide 14? Because I have a couple questions about that. Thank you. It says here at the bottom that we avoided layoffs, furloughs, and service reductions. So can I confirm whether or not we've returned weekend evening service to the northbound routes for transit? Because I know that's something we were partnering with UNCA on funding for.
Sure, we can get that information for you. I don't know if Tony, if you have, or Taylor, if you have a response to that today, but we'll get that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kim. I don't know the answer to that, but we'll find out for you.
Because if we have had service reductions, I just want to make sure that we're naming that we've avoided most or some service reductions. Because if that's one that we still have reduced, I'd be curious to know what other services that we have stepped back from.
Good point.
All right. Well, had to jump in a little earlier than expected. That's the world we're living in right now, I think. So yeah, I'm Taylor Floyd, the budget manager, and going to talk a little bit about our current, or I guess I should say next year, budget development process and what's been guiding the process this year and some significant changes we've made and what we're hoping to achieve. So to start with, we've used these three guiding principles: essential service delivery, customer value, and strategic alignment to guide the budget process over the last few years. And we're continuing to use these principles throughout this year's process. And we're really trying to emphasize our customer impact, and doing that by spending time talking through more specifically who is impacted by our services and how. Next slide. So also want to make note, these were the council priority strategies. These were prioritized at a council retreat that was 2 years ago now. And at last year's council retreat, we provided detailed information about three of these specifically: transit service, sustainability, and employee compensation. And that was actually the last in-person meeting that we had about the budget, because right after that, the pandemic happened. And so that was kind of where we left off on council strategies. Next slide. So looking kind of forward from some of the stuff that Tony was talking about, we're not at a point at this work session where we're gonna bring forward any specific numbers, but we will be coming back to you all with more info at later work sessions, both on revenue and on expenditures. We just kind of wanted to highlight a few things. The first being revaluation. It's going to be a critical part of the budget discussion, and Tony's actually going to hopefully get his IT issues worked out and come back to that a little bit later in this presentation. The second thing is, we're expecting to see kind of a recovery as the pandemic comes to an end, hopefully. And we're also expecting to see that sales tax growth that Tony was talking about continue into next fiscal year. We also have, we should know this week maybe about what opportunities we have around federal stimulus and what will be made available to us. That will likely present some opportunity to support our community. Again, as we try to make our way out of the pandemic and the economic impact of that. And then lastly, I just want to make note that we're assessing the impacts of changes to taxes, fees, and charges collectively, and we're trying to ensure that we're not just considering those resource needs that we have, but also thinking about what burden those changes might put onto our community. Again, kind of getting back to what Tony talked about, that quality services at a reasonable cost, right? Kind of trying to balance those two pieces. Next slide. So on the expenditure side, looking forward to next year, one thing, again, Tony mentioned some of the reductions that we had to make. We want to reinstate those where we have the opportunity. Also, already mentioned that mandated state retirement increase. We have the compensation study and implementation strategies around that. Peggy Rose is going to speak to that also later. Tony already mentioned the fire station and staffing up for that. And then we also have ongoing conversations around reimagining public safety, and we're still dialing in some of the resource needs for some of those services that we've already reallocated from APD, and we're continuing to look at opportunities to make changes to other services. Reparations work, I think, will be underway next year, and that will have some resource needs. And then we know transit service continues to be a priority for council and the community. So again, we always kind of see that the expenditure list is a little bit longer than the revenue list. And we're always trying to balance that. So, excuse me, I want to take some time to talk about how we've changed the internal budget process this year. And as Deborah said, we've tried to use this unique moment that we find ourselves in to push a little farther than we probably would have otherwise. And looking at those inputs, we wanted to build on the work that we've done to incorporate equity into our budget process over the last few years. So we've really centered the process around some questions to identify how services impact our community and where we might want to make some changes to improve that impact or mitigate negative impact. We've also used the financial uncertainty created by the pandemic to focus a little more on our existing services. Again, trying to dig into that work that we're doing every day, the core services that we're spending that $135 million general fund budget to provide. So what those changes look like in the process are a series of meetings with departments to talk through these questions. And we've specifically brought in the Office of Equity and Inclusion, CAPE, and the new Office of Data and Performance to lean on their expertise and help us develop these questions, help us talk through these questions with departments. Paulina Mendez is going to talk a little bit more about what we've done, and one of our external partners, Shemeka Ebony, is going to talk about how we're trying to coordinate that internal work with the community engagement that we're doing. And then what we're hoping to build through all of this work is increased communication, accountability, and transparency, both internally within the city and with the community, because we know these are places where we have opportunities to improve with the budget process. We also, they also directly relate to the core work that our partners are doing, that Equity, CAPE, and Data and Performance are doing. So we're hoping that while they're supporting our work right now, that we're supporting their future work and their ongoing work. And then lastly, if I had room to kind of draw another arrow out, maybe that's where I would want to kind of put that service delivery component. But what we're working towards is better service delivery for our community. We want to make sure we're making meaningful changes that people who rely on our services can see and feel. So that's kind of the ultimate goal always when we're making resource allocations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over again to one of the folks that's been helping us through this process, Paulina Mendez from the Office of Equity and Inclusion.
Hi everyone, Paulina Mendez. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the training consultant for the Office of Equity and Inclusion. It's great to see some familiar faces. I just want to invite y'all to take a second to maybe take a breath. If your day has been at all like mine, it might be nice just to take a breath while we look at this image here. And so I do want to ask you to look at this and tell me what you see. Tell me what any thoughts are that might come from looking at this image. Oh, all right. I guess we are moving on to this slide.
Oh, Beth, yeah, I was going to ask that.
You got to tell us in advance if you're going to ask us questions during a work session, or our brain is not ready for it.
Hi, Paulina.
But I do appreciate this is a variation on the image that we usually see with the ball game and the people on the blocks that are trying to look over the fence.
Exactly what I was going to say. And hi, Paulina. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, and so, it's interesting. So Shemeka and I are talking about equity and inclusion and engagement. And so, of course, we're going to engage you a little bit, right? So thank you so much for weighing in, Mayor Manheimer. So we talk about equity and inclusion, and we're rooting this process and budget with equity and inclusion, right? So if you look at that bottom right-hand square, you see justice. And you see those 2x4s prompting up that tree, right? So we know that equity is the path to justice, and applying an equity and inclusion lens is what's going to help us get there. And so now we can go to the next slide.
It looks a little healthier for the tree too.
Thank you, Kim. Right. And so with applying an equity and inclusion lens, it looks like asking a set of questions, right? So for this budget process, the framework questions that we've been having with departments are: who are the most impacted by inequity in our community? How do the services your departments provide affect those most impacted? And how can services be adjusted to enhance positive or mitigate negative impact? Next slide, please. So why focus on the most impacted? And if you'll click it for me. Curb cut effect. So if you've done a training with me, a 101 or a 201, you've heard me talk about the curb cut effect, right? This is a concept that a rising tide lifts all boats. It comes from the disability rights movement. And essentially, as a society, we either all rise or all fall, right? So we focus on those that are most impacted because when the walls of exclusion come tumbling down, everybody benefits. It also allows us as a city to be more specific about identifying the city's role in advancing equity and inclusion when we look at who's most impacted by inequities in our community. Next slide. So how do we change services? That's looking at uncovering negative impacts. It doesn't always feel great to uncover negative impacts, but how else are we going to know where we can improve, right? Even thinking about going to the doctor and getting a diagnosis that we may not want to get. It doesn't feel good to get that diagnosis, but once we know what the diagnosis is, we can treat it, right? So changing services looks at focusing on the positive, but also looking at uncovering negative impacts. With the budget process the way it is this year, we're looking at low or no cost options to change how we deliver services. There's been a lot of conversation around how we can collaborate better as a city interdepartmentally. And then, of course, an opportunity for continued public engagement to help identify solutions. This is talking about power with and not power over, right? This is talking about community engagement, and Shemeka is going to talk to us a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Pauline. It's been such a pleasure working with you over the past couple of months, amplifying this great city of Asheville. My name is Shemeka Ebony. I am from Shemeka Ebony Firm, and I am partnership with Christine Edwards of Amplify Consulting. Spent the latter part of last year working within the community, and we are now also engaging with the community again. Next slide, please. And we wanted to spend some time today to, first of all, let you know what is upcoming and how our firms are working with people in the community. Actually, this week, we'll be having our next session for our Community Engagement Academy. This Community Engagement Academy is working with people that are identifying as people with lived experience. These are BIPOC citizens, residents that are looking to amplify their leadership and engagement and how they are engaging meaningfully in the community as well as in partnership with the city. What you see also on this slide is the equity focused budget sections in alignment with what our budget department is working on to really amplify the voices of getting feedback from the community, getting an opportunity to create what we would come to understand as better practices of how we engage and get feedback and input from the community. You'll see that there are 2 rounds of input based on what we've heard. Is kind of the model that we're utilizing. Is this is what we heard, taking it back into the community, asking for feedback. Did we get it right? Is something still missing? And then going back and amending and adapting on the drawing board. Next slide, please. When we engaged under the Reimagining Public Safety, we really wanted to create an opportunity to not only amplify voices of those being impacted by inequities, but also give voice to those that wanted to look at how reimagining public safety means to them. We held 1 in-person session and several virtual sessions to really capture the voices and lived experience of those that wanted to partner in alignment with this engagement to really inform the budget process that you all saw magnified last year. Next slide, please. What you'll see is that the city received over 1,200 survey responses. I'll give you an opportunity to kind of read through the process as well as invite you to the city council report out that happened on September 22nd, where our community engagement report was presented by Ms. Deborah Campbell, and we're so appreciative of that. What I wanted to hone in on this slide is that even you all as our leaders in Asheville, taking a moment to just sit in this first question, what does safety mean to you? We asked citizens that were participating in this listening session for them to share this very thing. What it looked like, what did it feel like, what's missing and what's necessary and important, what needs to be reallocated, and what should maintain a priority, as well as one of the larger ones of who's missing from the conversation. And we took that to help amplify and inform how we began our meaningful engagement this next go round. Next slide, please. Through the engagement process, what was lifted up by Asheville residents is that there were more than one version of how people were seeing and experiencing the city of Asheville, and having that feedback helped us understand better who's missing from the conversation, what still could be worked on. For examples of this, even having the children give input, sharing safety videos, what it means for them to feel safe, was very important for us to be able to capture and make sure that their voices feel valued as well. Community organizers who have been involved with over 20 years of some aspect or form of community engagement showed up to these sessions to make sure that their voices were heard, in hopes that something new could be birthed out of this Reimagining series. Next slide, please. One of the things we wanted to do during this time is really center on laying a good foundation from what we did in the fall with Reimagining public safety, and the transition steps that are necessary for us to be able to advance racial equity in a meaningful way. What you see here is that we conducted listening sessions with community members. We also provided training and technical support to community members seeking to grow their engagement capacity. That was done with office hours, tool share, digital engagement sessions, information and videos that were shared with those that had expressed interest in growing their engagement capacity in the fall. Those individuals were also invited to come back and be a part of the Engagement Academy that is happening right now, to really amplify their ownership of their power and their voice to create change for themselves. In those virtual office hours, we were able to troubleshoot specifically what individuals may have had challenges with, and it gave us an opportunity to meaningfully engage in making those connections in the community that may not have been made yet, but with intention of creating a sustainable network on the ground. Next slide, please. In order to continue to work, it was so important for us to be able to not only work internally with meeting with the council and being a part of the department leaders team meetings, but also the external engagement, meaning that we were taking this information that we had received and really amplifying it in the community to get feedback. That is going to be happening between March and May, as you saw in the earlier slide, with dates specific to virtual engagement sessions, in order for people to be able to amplify their feedback about the budget process so far. These participants were either part of the public input community, they were on the listserv as signed up as residents to get alerts. It's also listed on the public input page. We engaged those that had engaged last year, as well as reached out to find new individuals that wanted to engage in the process. We had our info session in February about the Community Engagement Academy, and our first session actually will be launching this Thursday evening. The capacity building structure that we're focusing on is to support continued engagement, as well as helping this team co-design meaningful engagement strategies that they would like to see manifest, so that we can take this information back to the city and create an opportunity to create sustainable ways to meaningfully engage that's co-designed with the people being impacted. Next slide, please. Any questions?
Hi, Shamika. This is Sandra Kilgore. How are you?
Wonderful.
Good. I'd like to thank you very much for a very informative report. I've learned a lot, and I think the work that you're doing is just amazing. The question I have is, I know that I'd just like to know what platforms that you utilize actually to sort of reach out and engage in parts of the community that's not really engaging, so that you can get more of a idea of what, the community is thinking. I was just wondering, what platforms do you use? I noticed that, and the only reason I say that, I noticed that when I moved back home 12 years ago, in 2012, the one challenge that I had was actually making contact with a lot of the people in the community or that are impacted, but I wasn't able to get them to engage. And I found out that basically a lot of them didn't have email or access to computers and things of that nature. And what I found is pretty much you sort of had a sort of set groups that were more participatory in these sessions as opposed to getting a broad array of people involved so you could actually get an idea. So I was just wondering, what type of platforms do you utilize to sort of make sure you can get enough equity, basically, and diversity in the community involved in those conversations?
Great question. So for these sessions, we are currently holding convenings on Zoom, which are recorded and then uploaded on YouTube for any residents that may have missed it. I have also been engaging, utilizing Instagram, Facebook, social media groups that are specific to Asheville residents. And I've been engaging with young people, usually directly through text message or Instagram as means of engaging with them. One of our larger priorities is that we want to utilize this space to saturate with people that are already doing this work. So one of our methods, we're connecting with people that were already connected to other people, so that though there may be a group that is represented that is not at the table, there is someone that knows that they're missing, and then that person is taking that ownership and their leadership to be that voice, to take that message back, share the video link, share the PowerPoint, get feedback, and bring that back to our larger convening so that it's no one's voice is voided, but we all take that ownership and responsibility that if we can identify a group that's missing and we know someone from that population, to please be that communicator, translator, or bridge so that no one is left behind and no one's voice is missing.
Okay, and also, I know that basically, like I was saying, a lot of people in the community do not have the emails or the social media platforms, are not familiar with them. And I'm just making a suggestion. I don't know what kind of budget you have that you're working with, but I found out one of the better budgets for, especially if you're trying to communicate with the minority community, would be print and mail. Those are sort of archaic, but those are the things that work in the community for as far as getting attention, and also maybe reaching out to the churches. But like I said, I don't know what your budget is, but those are two avenues that I found that sort of give you more insight into what a lot of the older community members, contact with them. And that's just a suggestion if you would like to maybe utilize that too.
It is welcome. We've had representatives from the Council of Churches that have been in partnership walking with us, and they are kind of taking this information back to the larger groups. So we definitely want to not have anyone feel like they're left behind. And we are so happy that some of the residents that are involved in the Academy who've amplified community members that you've identified that may not necessarily be on social media, I've kind of challenged them to be those ambassadors and take that message back, because again, it's going to be more meaningful coming from those that are championing this change more consistently versus what I could possibly come in and say. I'm just given a platform and a space to amplify what's already being done and how we can collectively do it better together. So I love what you mentioned. Thank you so much for your recommendations, and I think we're definitely going to include that. We did last go around when we put signs up in the community when we did our Reimagining Public Safety. So this could be another opportunity to consider print posters to get this word out, as well as continuing to challenge our ambassadors to be that vessel and voice of change to help us bridge that gap that you amplify. Thank you so much for your recommendation.
Thank you. Thank you so much too.
Are there any other questions?
This is Kim. I have just a couple of questions, just because I know that we had a very successful endeavor with the noise ordinance, reaching out to neighbors that hadn't previously participated in our engagement efforts. So if you had an opportunity to look and see what tools were effective in reaching, say, our historic Black neighborhoods, legacy neighborhoods, or perhaps reaching out to neighborhoods that don't speak English as the primary language?
Yeah. Go ahead, Shemeka.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. We've been in partnership with CAPE, who has been such a great asset to our boots on the ground. Brenda has been phenomenal in being that extension of a leg. We've also, during the first round of engagement, sought out an organization that could partner and walk alongside of us with the language barrier that it may be English not having a primary language. We did not want them to be left out of the conversation, and we welcome that partnership with this level of engagement again for this round. We had an opportunity to review those steps. We're certainly amplifying the better practices that Asheville residents have successfully been able to engage. One of the things that you brought up that is very important that we are considerate of is the timing of the sessions, making sure that it is accessible even if it's a recording, as well as making sure that the overall goal is amplified from the ground up, and that means co-designing with those people that are impacted by the change. So I welcome if any of those that led that outreach and work would like to walk in alignment and partner with this budget engagement cycle. We welcome the partnership. We certainly want to make sure that no one's voice is left out. So there is certainly still time to come to the table and partner with us. Our first Academy session is going to be this Thursday.
And where can folks get information about that first Academy session?
Public input has the link that you can sign up and register. And pretty much right now, we are looking to meaningfully engage over the next couple of months with the same group of people to really saturate some foundation among those that are leading leaders. So these are individuals that are self-identifying, people with lived experience, as well as those that are either an ally or voice for or standing in partnership and sharing voice with. So we want to make sure that anyone that's interested in being a part of that, so please check out the public input page. You can find that on the engagement hub, and that link is right there. You can just one click, sign up, fill out our Academy form, and our staff will be reaching out to you with the links to get you plugged in and caught up for our session on Thursday night.
Thank you, Shamika. My last question is, have you had any experience with the engagement ambassador program similar to like what Durham is doing?
Well, as far as the engagement ambassador program in Durham, that model is great. I've also looked at the model out of state. I've looked at models across the country as well as models out of Canada. And what I help support and amplify is exposing those models to the local community and giving them space to co-design what's meaningful for them. Because every community is different and unique. And we want to make sure that if citizens and participants can find themselves in the model, then it creates a foundation for it to be sustainable. And when it's co-designed by people that are impacted, then the sustainability rates are extended as well. So we do take in consideration other states' models as well as other city models, but we also yield to what Asheville says their better practices are based on their lived experience, expertise. And I have had the pleasure to realize that there are some citizens that have been in the engagement process 20 plus years. So we have some experts in the room that are all more than welcome to give feedback on what better practices could be had.
Thank you. I really enjoyed meeting you when you were in town the first time, and I'm glad to see this presentation from you today.
Yes, thank you. If there are no other questions, thank you for your time and happy Women's History Month, everyone.
Thank you, Shamika.
Okay, I think I'm back.
Tony?
Can everybody hear me? I think I'm back. Okay, all right. Sorry, I had some network issues, but so just wanted to finish off the budget discussion before we turn it over to Peggy Rowe to talk about compensation by going through a few slides related to revaluation. As you all know, this is a revaluation year, and there's been some stories in the newspaper and some likely some questions from the community about what revaluation means and where we're headed with that. So next slide, please. So just as a reminder, the property tax rate, and if you remember from one of the earlier slides, property taxes are by far and away the biggest general fund revenue source. The property tax rate is set by city council. But the values related to property, those are determined by the county tax assessor. And there's essentially four major components of the property tax base. The biggest one is the real property, which is what I think most folks think of when they think of the property tax and property, and that's residential and commercial properties. There's three other smaller categories, the first of which is called personal property, and it's actually slightly misnamed because most of the value in that category comes from business equipment. So for example, a New Belgium brewery or ACA hospital, the equipment within those businesses is taxed on a depreciation schedule. And so that's where most of that value is. There's also a public utility category, and that's things like Progress Energy and the gas company. And as you all know, it's probably because you get a separate motor vehicle bill from the state, the property tax rate is also applied to all licensed motor vehicles in North Carolina. So next slide, please. So what are the takeaways from that? So those three categories I mentioned last, the smaller ones, personal property, public utilities, and motor vehicles, those values are updated every year. So for example, when you get your tax bill for your vehicle from the state, you'll notice every year that value has gone down a little bit based on the depreciation schedule for your vehicle. And so all those rates are updated every year, all those values are updated every year. But the real property component, again, the largest part, commercial and residential, those values are only updated here in Buncombe County every 4 years, or when the assessment sales ratio drops below 85%. And that second piece is a state requirement that automatically triggers a revaluation, even if you haven't gone the required 4 years. So next slide. So this is a little history kind of to look back at when previous revaluations have occurred. So the last one to occur here in Buncombe County was in FY18. And you can see at that point that property values on average in the city of Asheville grew by 23%, and that the city lowered the property tax rate as a part of that cycle. The previous revaluation actually occurred in FY14, and that one was a little atypical compared to what most revaluations lead to in terms of property value changes, because we were coming out of the Great Recession and property values had either gone down or had not grown very much since the previous revaluation in 2007. So where are we at now? Next slide, please. So as you all may know,
Hey, Tony, this is Esther. Can you go back to, I do not understand this slide. Like what, I see the bar that shows us the tax rate there, 42 cents to 46, back down to 0.4289. What is the assessed value? I mean, I think people would look at this and say, hold on, I just got my new property tax value from Buncombe County, and we just read a news article that said property tax values went up by whatever it was, 20+%. And in 2016, the values went up. When people got their assessments in 2016, the values went up countywide by, I don't remember what it was, 25% or whatever it is. So can you explain what are the bars there at the bottom showing us, starting with the 4% and then 1%, 1%, 1%? What is that?
Yeah, great question. So happy to answer that. So the dark bars represent kind of what I call the normal years when we don't have revaluation. So what happens in those years? The growth in the tax base is purely based on new construction. So you can see in most non-revaluation years, our tax base is growing. Well, when we were coming out of the recession in FY11, 12, 13, there wasn't a whole lot of growth. We've picked up growth in the last couple of years, primarily because of the ACA mission value coming on the tax rolls. And so that's why the FY19 and FY20 values were up by 4% and 6%. But what we really wanted to highlight here again, I think, is those lighter color bars, particularly the one in FY18. And that's what happened. There was the last time there was a revaluation. Values went up by 23%. And at that point, the city lowered its property tax rate from about 47.5 cents down to 42.89. So so
that was the last reval year was 2018. So if we were to see the bar for FY, well, I don't know, what do you call it? FY 22.
Hard to believe, right?
Okay, so even though you just got your letter, folks just got their letter now saying what the values of their homes are, it'll show up on our chart as FY22 reval, and that will show the percentage. So back in 14, there wasn't a change in value for real property overall, even with the reval. Okay, but now we're starting to see this pretty accelerated value growth for real estate.
Yeah, and like I said, that FY14 revaluation really was atypical because we were coming out of the recession. The other revaluations since I've been here in the city, we've typically had somewhere between 20, 25, even 30% growth for the 3 or 4 other revaluations that I've been here for.
That would be when, like much earlier on.
Much earlier, yeah.
Before this chart. That's how long you've been around. Just before this chart even. Okay.
You had to say that, didn't you? That hurt.
Yeah.
No. I started here in '98.
You didn't say before Excel, Tony.
Before we had bar charts.
Yeah, the last reval that's not shown on this chart was in FY07, and the county actually delayed the revaluation because of the economic recession. So we actually went 7 years between 07 and 14 with no revaluation done. And then they did one in FY14, which again, like I said, was very atypical. And then we're back to kind of a normal pattern with FY18. And actually on the next slide, if you want to ask your question, but the next slide has information about what we're seeing preliminarily. I think this is what you alluded to, Mayor. The values that were mailed out in early February showed a preliminary change of about 18% countywide. So again, it looks like values are going to be up similarly to what they were 4 years ago, but maybe not quite as much overall, at least at the county level. We don't have city-specific numbers just yet to look at. And part of that reason we don't have city-specific numbers to share at the moment is the appeal process is still taking place through the Buncombe County Tax Assessor's Office, and that's open until April 21st. And then we'll be setting a tax rate based off of those values. But before I go any further, Sage, do you have a question?
Just briefly, I guess I received some correspondence that said we're required to do it 8 years, but it is actually every 4 years, not 8. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
I was going to say, state statute says every 8 years, but Buncombe County chooses to do it every 4.
that's what they were referring to. Okay, thank you for clearing that up. Question, do we ever break down the growth between residential and commercial property tax for visual purposes? I'm curious where those rates grow.
The rates are all the same. Do you mean how much revenue we get?
Yeah, how much revenue, yes.
Yeah, we actually, we can. I don't think we've provided that the last couple of years, but we have all that data, the breakdown between what is residential versus what is commercial in the city of Asheville. And happy to provide that. Any other questions?
This is Kim. One of the questions that I have is, can we request from Buncombe County a breakdown in the revaluation by zoning and by use, a little bit further detail than it normally is? For example, hospital, medical, hotel, lodging, residential, et cetera.
Yes, we can do that. Yeah, they can break the data down essentially any way that we would like it. So, any other questions? I got a couple more slides, and then we can pause again for questions if you all would like. Okay, so next slide. So the last bullet point on the previous slide mentioned the tax rate, and so here in North Carolina, state statute requires that anytime there is a revaluation, that all the local governments within the county that has the reval calculate and publish what's called a revenue neutral tax rate. And it's a little complicated what the definition is of it. I've included it on this slide. Happy to try and explain further, but it's essentially the rate that we would have to put in place to produce the same amount of revenue that we would have gotten in property taxes if there hadn't been a revaluation. And so there's a lot of information from the School of Government out there if you all are interested in learning more about what that means. I think the main takeaway is that we have to calculate the rate, and I think that's on the next slide. Beth, if you go to the next slide, are the kind of the next steps for us. I mentioned a couple slides ago that we're awaiting updated value estimates from the county. The county would continue to update those values for us as they go through the appeal process, and then per those general statutes, the city will calculate and publish what's called the revenue neutral tax rate as part of the manager's recommended budget in May. So I think that's the last slide on this. Again, happy to circle back and answer any questions. And also, like I said, there's a lot of information out there from the School of Government and other folks across the state about what this means, and happy to provide that as well.
Tony, this is Gwen. Just to clarify for the public, when we talk about revenue neutral, we do that on the aggregate. Whereas someone may have a large decrease in their value, some might have a large increase in their value, but the number that we use to come up with revenue neutral is the valuation on the aggregate. So, right?
That's correct.
Okay. I just, we should clarify that for people because, even though we may stay at a revenue neutral, they still may get an increase or a decrease.
That's correct as well. Yes. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all. I think that's the end of the budget slides. I'll hand it off to Peggy.
Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of council. Peggy Rose, Special Assistant to the City Manager, and I'm going to present to you today at a high level the findings from our consultant, the Archer Company, regarding our total compensation package in the city. Next slide, please. Go ahead to the next slide, Beth. Thank you. Key takeaways: a competitive and fair compensation package is at the center of what employees want from their employer. The city's salary structure is below the market average on all key comparisons. Paying less than competitive salaries has a negative impact on service delivery. By ensuring that the pay structure is competitive, the city will be better able to attract and retain employees. And there is some good news, and that is that the city's benefits package is generally very competitive. Next slide, please. What I would like to present to you today is the current status of the city's comp and benefits, demonstrate the urgent need to address the compensation shortfall, provide some options and costs for each, and ask for your direction for the path forward. There are in the full report, there are lots of opportunities and options, and we are presenting to you just a couple of those today. So next slide, please. According to decades of research and reports by Mercer, PayScale, SHRM, IPMA, Gallup, competitive compensation results in employees feeling valued. And employees who feel valued are 20% more productive. Next slide, please. What employees want from their employer: flexibility in the workplace, respect, interesting and meaningful work, autonomy, and you can see at the center of that is competitive and fair pay. Next slide, please. The Mercer Company says whether employers are competing for new talent, establishing fair pay for employees, or making market adjustments to secure the workforce, quality salary data is essential for creating pay packages that allow the employer to find, keep, and motivate the right people with the right skills. Next slide, please. The city of Asheville seeks to set its base pay at 100% of the average market within our defined markets, and to set total compensation, which is salaries and benefits, at or near the defined competitive market. This compensation philosophy is prevalent among most local government and public sector employers. The key tenets of the study were to engage the relationship between the city of Asheville's current compensation against this stated philosophy. Next slide, please. The scope of work: as you might recall, the Archer Company was engaged in 2019 to analyze the city's compensation and benefits package and provide recommendations to the city manager on the following. Is the current pay and benefits package competitive with the market? What is the feasibility of raising the minimum salary to $31,200 annually? What, if any, compression issues exist and how should those be addressed? And what, if any, overall inequities exist and how should they be addressed? Next slide, please. The work that was completed spring of last year was moving our minimum salary for employees to $31,200, which represents an annualized salary based on $15 an hour for a 40-hour work week. And we also address some specific compression issues around that movement of the minimum. Next slide, please. Archer stated in their report that certain aspects of the pay structure at the city are not competitive. The city has difficulty in attracting and retaining employees in some positions. These facts, given the city's stated compensation policy to pay 100% of market average, led Archer to recommend new pay ranges that will make the city of Asheville salaries more competitive. Next slide, please. Overall, the city's salary structure is below the market average on all key comparisons, says the Archer Company. The city's minimum pay rates are at 92% of market, midpoint rates at 91% of market, and again, in order to compete, our goal is to be at 100% of market. By ensuring that the pay structure is competitive, again, we'll be better able to attract and retain employees. Next slide, please. So how were the jobs analyzed? Employees were all asked to complete questionnaires, and based on some of the factors that they included in their questionnaires and the answers that they provided, points were assigned based on the formula that the Archer Company uses. There were multiple meetings with directors and human resources. They collected data from market-based research, and then there was a great deal of follow-up as needed for clarification. Next slide, please. I talked earlier, there's some good news, and that is that our benefit practices are competitive with the market. We're consistent generally as it relates to paid holiday practice, although we will be recommending the inclusion of Veterans Day as a paid holiday. Our retirement is consistent with market. Our 401k and 457 plans are consistent, and we're more generous in some areas, the accrual of sick leave, accrual of annual leave, and tuition reimbursement. Next slide, please. Some recommendations that Archer made, we asked Archer to look at paid parental leave. They found that 29% of the respondents that they surveyed offer some type of paid parental leave, but it is an emerging benefit, and it is one that we are recommending for the city. Generally speaking, though, we don't have a policy finalized yet. 6 weeks paid parental leave recommended for the birth of a child, adoption, foster placement. And just as an FYI, the city had 71 employees last year who used leave for these types of reasons. And there are no short-term costs for this, but there are some long-term costs in terms of employees being paid an additional 6 weeks, thereby allowing them to continue to accrue and maintain annual and sick leave banks that could be paid out at a later date. Annual holiday schedule, I mentioned earlier, we will be recommending the addition of Veterans Day, and that cost to implement is $25,000 for overtime pay. Next slide, please. There's a direct linkage between effectively communicating organizations' compensation strategy and the level of employee engagement, job satisfaction, and retention. So one thing Archer did recommend is that the city share with employees the value of the benefits by providing annual total reward statements. Additionally, they made some notes regarding benefits that the primary challenges employers are expected to have over the next 3 years include the rising benefits costs, communicating choices, and responding to different needs and wants of multi-generational workforce. Next slide, please. So I'll pause here before I move into compensation just to see if there are any questions about the benefits piece. Councilwoman Turner.
Thank you, Peggy. I just want to make sure I heard right. The parental leave, we want to add it, we already have it, or we want to grow it?
We want to add it as a paid benefit. Currently, we do, of course, have family medical leave, and employees receive that if they're eligible. They use their annual leave or sick time to cover their salary during their absence. This policy would require the city to pay them, and they would not have to use their annual or sick leave. Additionally, employees who don't have annual leave or sick leave would be eligible to receive pay.
Thank you so much.
This is Kim. Peggy, I have a question about parental leave as well. How does this compare with the benefit offered by the county or other major employers in the region?
It is comparable to the one in the county. It is a really an emerging benefit. Our consultants found that most companies are looking very closely at it, though not many are yet offering the benefit. But it's anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks, and we can get more detail from them about that, Kim, if you want that.
Thank you, Peggy.
You're welcome.
You mentioned some negative effects of parental leave if it extends 6 weeks. Could you just reemphasize that point? I didn't hear.
Well,
I don't remember.
Yeah, I think what I mentioned, Vice Mayor, is that there would be some costs long-term in that if you are on a paid parental leave and the city's continuing to pay you for 6 weeks, you're not using your sick leave or your annual leave. So you continue to grow that bank and maintain that bank. And at a later date, those can be converted into cash when you leave the city, those kinds of things. So it's a long-term potential cost, an unfunded liability, if you will, but it does not cost anything in the short run. Did that help?
It's Peggy. It's Peggy.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not an unfunded, I mean, from accounting purposes, you do accrue for that. So it isn't like it's gonna, I mean, it would be recorded as an expense as you go. So, I mean, I just don't want it to sound like, down the road, you're just gonna have this big chunk of expense you didn't recognize. For accounting purposes, you actually do accrue that.
Thank you. And Tony, it looks like you jumped in here too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Gwen's right, it is accounted for in the financial statements. It's an accrued expense on our balance sheet. So it doesn't actually show up as a general fund expense in governmental accounting, but it does show up on the balance sheet. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So one follow-up is, it's my understanding that the county actually provides 8 weeks of parental leave. So as we're starting this new program, to ensure that we provide good benefits and are competitive in our employment and also, a good place to work, I think it would be a good opportunity to look and see those benchmarks, what the cost comparison would be, and then opportunities to engage the public and get some feedback.
Okay, we can certainly look closely at what the county is doing and some other surrounding areas as well.
Thank you.
And at the time that Archer conducted the survey, Buncombe County had not yet adopted their policy. They have since done that. So I'm sure the numbers have increased since their initial survey.
Just a follow-up, because I had a similar concern to Councilwoman Roney about the county in comparison, because I seem to, I don't know if I'm sensing this or if it's accurate, that do we lose employees to the county fairly often?
We lose quite a few to the county. It depends on how you define fairly often, I guess, but we lose police officers to the sheriff's department, and we've lost some employees in the financial arena to the county. So yes, they definitely are a strong competitor in terms of benefits and salaries.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I move on? Okay, next slide, please. Most of our departments have some positions that are below market in terms of the salary. Then next slide, please. Approximately 655 employees, which represents about 50% of our current workforce with the city, earn a salary below the minimum being recommended by the Archer Company. Next slide, please. This is just an example of the types of jobs that are currently below the minimum being recommended by the Archer Company, just to give you a sense of the magnitude. Next slide, please. So for example, if you look on this chart, and obviously this is just a few, at the sanitation driver, the current minimum salary that we pay is $31,200. And by the way, that is as a result of our movement to $31,200 in April of last year. The recommended minimum is 38,293. The maximum currently is 46,299. The recommended maximum is 57. And I'll just highlight a couple of others. Police, our current minimum is 37,500. The recommendation by Archer is 44,738. And then for firefighters, our current minimum is 33,900, and the recommendation by Archer is 45,800. So next slide, please.
Just to clarify, those are certain classifications within all of our job descriptions. I don't want anyone to be thinking that firefighters make, firefighter here means like firefighter one, I assume, because we have captains, we have.
Sure, yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
That's correct. These are just specific classifications. We have seniors, we have engineers, we have a lot of other employees within the fire department and police department and the others who have different classifications. This is a very entry level, just out of training firefighter. Thank you. Next slide, please. I want to talk real briefly about employee turnover. Generally, organizations want to have 10% or less turnover. And average for local government in recent years has been about 11.8. Down below, you can see a chart for our past 5 years turnover. Last year, in 2020, we had 18% turnover in the city. 2019, 11, 2018 and 2017, 15%. So you can see it's significantly higher than the desirable 10% rate. Next slide, please. City of Asheville turnover, the departments where we had significant turnover are police department, and you can see primarily in patrol, public works, and you can see primarily sanitation and stormwater, parks and rec, and you can see primarily parks maintenance, and water resources, primarily water maintenance and water production. Next slide, please. So we found that there definitely is a correlation between the departments that have the heaviest turnover and the areas where we find the biggest gap between what we currently pay and what Archer recommends we pay as it relates to the market. Positions with high turnover may be attributed to the non-competitive pay rates, and significant turnover directly impacts services to the community, response times, and basic infrastructure support, as you can see. Next slide, please. Turnover costs in general, organizations estimate that the turnover of a position costs 1.5 times the annual salary for that position. So for example, hard cost would be the cost to recruit, staff time, interview time, background checks, overtime for folks who are filling in, backfilling positions with temp workers, et cetera. The soft costs would include loss of productivity, loss of institutional knowledge, the learning curve and training time needed for the new employee. So, for example, a laborer who earns $31,200 leaves the organization. The cost to replace that person is estimated to be at $46,800. And keeping in mind, 18% is the turnover we experienced just in last year. Next slide, please. The new pay structure implementation is critical in order to ensure a thriving local economy and clean, healthy environment. We must have talented, stable workforce. Archer recommends that our compensation structure be increased and that it be evaluated annually. There are several possible ways to begin to address the issue. And I mentioned in the report, there are a number of different options. We're going to cover a couple of those with you today. But before we do that, I just want to make sure we have a kind of common understanding and definition about compression. So if you could go to the next slide. Compression occurs when a new hire the same as or more than current workers in the same position, or when two or more positions that have different levels of responsibility have same or similar pay, or when the pay difference between employee levels shrinks so that higher level workers feel that their pay advantage is no longer significant. So an example on the next slide, please, would be an employee earns $27,200. Their supervisor earns $32,500, so that's a $5,000 difference. the organization raises the minimum to 31.2, this means the employee receives a $4,000 increase to move to the new minimum. The supervisor now earns $1,000 more than that employee. And again, there are a number of ways to address compression. We won't cover them all by any means, but I just wanted to make sure we have that definition. Next slide. Any questions about, before I get to the examples? Yes, ma'am, Gwen.
Hey Peggy, thank you for this. I guess you're waiting for the big reveal pretty soon here. But the analysis of the 18% turnover, I assume that's in the aggregate. Do we
Yes.
have a breakdown of what was voluntary and what was involuntary?
I can get that. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, because I think, I'd like to, I realize that probably the 11% is a valid comparison, both involuntary and voluntary, but it might be meaningful, when we're thinking about it
Okay.
going forward, please.
And I'll be happy to share that. It does include all turnover, except for, of course, temp seasonals, for any reason. And of course, the impact in terms of recruiting and replacing and so forth is the same, but we certainly can get that breakdown for you.
Right, and the other question I'd have is, it seems just anecdotally that there's a lot of folks who are sort of retiring.
Yes.
And so I'd like to understand what impact the age of our employees, what do you see that effect has in the short term?
Okay. So you want to know the average age year over year for the last few years as compared to current?
Right, and then, what your take on that, the effect of that is. I don't know whether we tend to have a older workforce or a younger workforce, but, I think thinking about it long-term, it would be interesting. Because, I know I work with another organization and they have a very aging population, and I think it's going to come and, you have to anticipate those retirements and think about how you're going to plan for that.
Yeah, succession planning. Okay, I can get that.
Just one side comment on that too. That makes me think about the potential family leave in the age groups and things. And I wonder if there's a way. I don't know how you can't ask people if they have children, I guess, but I'm curious, how many families could be impacted by the potential family leave.
Well, they gave us an earlier data point that 71 people took leave last year related to children,
Correct.
like childbirth. That gives us a good benchmark. We have about how many employees in the city right now? 1,200, 1,250?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I wonder if there are more that would have.
Well, now that would be a little tricky to gauge. Maybe a survey.
Yeah, I think the question, that's a great question, Sage. And part of it is how many people struggled as a result of adding children because they weren't eligible for FMLA or didn't have sick and annual leave to cover the expense while they were out.
I guess
sorry.
Follow up just for future. You may not know right now. I would love to know what's defined as parental. Are we looking at, man and wife and child? Are there alternative, structures of family that we would support in that?
Yes, and it would be for any parent who is in our workforce would be eligible. As long as they meet whatever the requirements are that we define for eligibility, they would be eligible for that benefit.
And does that include adoptive parents?
Yes. Ma'am. And foster. Kim, I think you had your hand up again, or is that from before?
Yes, thank you. So this seems like a positive step in first just identifying where our issues have been with lagging wages. And I know, like Gwen said, we're going to get a reality check here in a second, but this is especially important considering our firefighters as first responders. So I'm looking at the hours, and it looks like in comparison to about 2,080 hours, our firefighters are working more than 2,900 hours. And this gets them much closer to our what we claim for our living wage. It's about 6 cents difference. It's unfortunate we don't have public comment in these work sessions because we have a lot of community partners who could help us navigate this conversation. But because we have community partners who have been addressing affordability, like the Family Friendly Affordable Buncombe Coalition, I think it would be a missed opportunity if we don't engage them at this point before we make any final decisions, just in case we're missing opportunities or key points. And I definitely suggest we should circle back with Just Economics regarding our living wage compliance.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the living wage because we will, of course, have an increase in the living wage in July. So that will be a factor as well.
And my understanding is that with benefits, it's $15.80 an hour now.
Yes, as of July. Yes, ma'am. Other questions before as Gwen said, the big reveal? Okay. Next slide, please. So if we were to take all of the employees that, and I mentioned before, they're 655 approximately, and move those employees to the new minimum being recommended by Archer, the cost to do that is $4.5 million. And then to adjust for compression for employees who are already at or above that minimum, and provide some type of an adjustment to employees is 3.3 for a total estimated cost of 7.8 million. And this is an approximate number. Next slide, please. Pros of this option are recommended pay structure is fully in place. So in other words, our minimums and maximums would match what Archer is recommending, provides a competitive advantage for recruiting and retaining employees, addresses compression issues. The cons are, of course, the cost, and then this type of an expenditure would compete with other needs in cities and priorities. Other needs of the city and other priorities of the city. Next slide, please. Archer, if you see the entire report, again, you'll see that they offer a number of different phased-in implementations, one of which is a 2-year implementation. If you'll recall, the employees filled out a questionnaire, and I talked about how those questionnaires resulted in some points being assigned to each of their positions. So year one, if we adopted a 2-year phase-in, would have the 449 points or lower, which means our kind of entry-level positions move their salaries to the new minimums, do a flat adjustment for employees who are at above the new minimum, adjust the rates for police and fire. And I call this out because police and fire are currently on a step plan. So moving them to their respective step on their step plan, the total cost in year one would be 4.9 million. And then in year two, of course, we'd adjust the salaries for the remaining employees. Next slide, please. The pros of this are it addresses the employees in the entry-level positions where lower pay rates in the departments, where there tend to be a lot lower pay rates in the departments, and they are experiencing significant turnover. It addresses the most egregious salary deficiencies. The cons, compression will continue to exist during the 2-year implementation. It'll have an adverse impact on morale. Employees may not have confidence that the city is committed to implementing year two, and recruitment and retention issues will remain a factor. Next slide, please. So again, there are a number of recommendations in the report from an operational standpoint, but just to highlight a few for you. Again, evaluating the salary structure annually and making adjustments to the minimums and maximums as needed. And they also have included the implementation of some career ladders for certain job families. So we'll be taking advantage of some of those recommendations. Next slide, please. In summary, the turnover rate in key areas exceeds a healthy operational level for the organization. Below market salaries negatively impact the organization's ability to compete in the marketplace. Implementing new pay structure enhances the ability to attract and retain talented employees. Next slide, please. And again, the key takeaways: a competitive and fair compensation package is at the center of what employees want from their employer. The city's salary structure is below the market average on all key comparisons. Paying less than competitive salaries has a negative impact on service delivery. By ensuring that the pay structure is competitive, the city will be better able to attract and retain employees. The city's benefit package, as I mentioned previously, is generally very, very competitive. And with that, next slide, please. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And Deborah, I don't know if you had any additional comments.
I can let them ask questions and then I can summarize.
Hello, Peggy. Could you please, I sort of got confused with the compression when you were giving the example where the employee, once you brought them up to a certain level, then they pretty much, the supervisor was only $1,000 higher than that income. And I'm trying to figure out if you're increasing salaries across the board, why would that supervisor's salary not be affected also?
It would. Ideally, we will address compression. I just use that as an example to show what could happen if employers don't take that step to address the compression. But in our scenario, we would want to do that, to do some type of an adjustment in that example, so the supervisor would receive an increase.
And unfortunately, what has happened in the past is that we haven't had the resources generally to address the compression issues. That's why when we moved to the $31,200 last year, we were very, very insistent upon that we address the compression, some of the compression issues, because it does have an impact, excuse me, on morale, particularly for people who have been here for a length of time.
And generally, it's difficult to do one for one. So in other words, if you move that, in that example, the employee, $4,000 increase, you wouldn't necessarily move everybody up by $4,000, but you would want to use some type of system to make adjustments so that their salaries continue to move forward.
I think both Gwen and Antoinette had some follow-up questions. If you're finished, Sandra, did you have another question?
That's it.
Thank you.
So I was curious, going back a couple of slides where there was that alternative, say if salaries weren't adjusted across the board, and it said, yes, this one, police and fire. Mm-hmm. Can you explain to me again why police and fire were chosen? And if we were to go with this alternate plan, would that then mean for like water, for example, compression would still be potentially happening such that technically someone who comes in later, even if he or she gets an increase, could, in pretty short order, if other benchmarks are met, end up earning more than someone who had been there longer?
It could, if you implement year one. Certainly in water and public works, most of those entry-level positions would be addressed in year one in this scenario. So the sanitation workers, the laborers, the equipment operators, many of those would be addressed in that first year. And then other employees would be given a salary adjustment. And we use in this example 2.5%. If they were already at that minimum or above, they would be given a 2.5% increase. So it would mean that if I've been here a year, my salary is going to go up 2.5%, or assuming I make the minimum or greater. And an employee who just gets hired makes the minimum, and I only make 2.5% more than they do. So it does create some compression issues down the road when you implement in a phased approach like this. And as to the police and fire, they're on a different type of plan. They're on a step plan. And so what this does is move them. In other words, if a firefighter is on step 2, then they would go to step 2 in the new plan. So it just calls them out only because they are on a different type of pay plan than the general employees. I don't know if that helped you, Antoinette. A little bit? I'm sorry.
No, that's fine, thank you.
I think you've got Gwen and Kim.
Okay, Peggy, thank you. So you talked a little bit about, how much the turnover costs the city.
Yes, ma'am.
Do we anticipate that we would, budget in some of those cost savings, with implementation of this? I wouldn't think that we would literally make money on doing this, but, which, saying that it costs you 1.5 times somebody's salary when you get turnover. But how, one, would you consider that in a budget going forward? And 2, how would you determine how much that is?
Yeah, and I don't know that you could necessarily budget moving forward on that. What you gain from that is you have fewer people turning over. So you are certainly spending a lot less in recruiting time. You also gain hugely as it relates to productivity, because now instead of recruiting and interviewing and spending time training on sanitation workers over and over and over again, we're fully functional. Residents are getting the services that they need, and all the employees who are tied up interviewing and recruiting and working overtime and doing additional jobs would be fully functioning in their current job. So you could potentially certainly save in overtime costs, but I think it would be difficult to quantify that in a way that you could actually put a number in the budget, other than the savings of the overtime and the huge increase in productivity.
Well, but, if we don't include it in the budget, it sort of makes the whole argument. If you basically aren't gonna have some savings offsetting this increase, you're basically making the argument that, it negates your argument that there's a high cost to turnover. And so, I would just really encourage us to consider that and, it sounds like you're a little bit talking out both sides of your mouth. Turnover costs a whole bunch.
But is the high cost of turnover?
You're not willing to decrease costs. So I just would encourage you to think about that, and when you're putting this together, to incorporate some of that concept into our budget.
I just wonder if high cost of turnover doesn't sometimes mean it takes staff time for people who are already employed and you're already paying their salary, and it's sort of hard to quantify.
Right.
Maybe there is a way to quantify it, and I know that different industry sectors have tried to quantify it. I just was.
Well, what it would also suggest is, if you're spending a lot of time recruiting, then you will need less supervisors, you will need less turnover, et cetera. I'm going to be a little disappointed if we just put the entire cost in there and assume that we have no savings whatsoever. To me, then you sort of have, then it's hard for me to justify it based on the argument that turnover costs us a lot of money.
Sure, and I understand that. We will do the best we can to quantify it, but turnover begets turnover. So I think when an employee is now doing 2 jobs where they were previously doing 1 job, it tends to drive them to wonder if this is the right place for them as well. So I think a lot of the costs are the additional time. We certainly can quantify it in terms of overtime and in terms of the recruitment expense. But I think if a person is working 2 jobs because of turnover, it would be it'd be difficult to say that you're not going to go ahead and replace that additional employee, right? But we can certainly put some numbers to that, but it probably is not going to be a $1-for-$1 dollar, but we could certainly put some numbers to it.
I think you have, yeah.
Yeah, if we can just go back to that slide with option 2, I feel really strongly that one of the important parts of naming our firefighters is I feel like it is an embarrassment to our organization that we have more than 70 firefighters making less than $12 an hour, and that the narrative has been that they can work other jobs and live outside of town. So they have been speaking up in meetings in budget comment periods for years. They've been advocating for themselves in the streets and our town squares. And I think at a minimum, we have to do this to quite literally value our first responders. And I have a hard time thinking that the compression is that we want to work and live in a town where we don't pay our firefighters well.
And I just really want to clarify that certainly we value our firefighters as well as every employee at the city of Asheville. But I would also add that additionally, our police and firefighters are paid on a different pay plan because they work different hours and shift, at least for fire persons. And so, Peggy, I don't know if you have any additional information that you want to add to that, but what I will say just very, very quickly is compensation for employees is, quite frankly, we hope that we have conveyed this and that the Archer study has conveyed this, is extremely important. And it's not just important every 3 or 4 years, it's important every year. And it is the reason that, unfortunately, other communities are able to compete relatively easily to attract our very, very talented employees away from us. And oftentimes we have found that that is due to the salaries that we pay. What we found from the Archer report is that our benefits are pretty good. In fact, in some areas, they're better than good. They're really good. It's the salary piece that is the challenge. And it is complicated because every time you move one person, then it has an impact on the other person's salary. And that's why we talk a lot about compression, that it's always kind of a moving target. But as you all know, when I came in my first year and just seeing that turnover in that revolving door, I said, we've got to get a handle on this if we truly want to address the issue of retention, and if we want to attract good new employees. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deborah. I don't know that I can add anything to what you said. Certainly, we have a high value and appreciation for police and fire and all of our employees, and it is not an accurate comparison to compare the way fire and police are paid to our general employees because they do have a different pay schedule. But certainly it is critically important to us that they be paid fairly, and competitively. And I think implementing this plan will get us there.
I think it's Antoinette, Sage, and Gwen. I think that was the order. Antoinette, do you have a question? Okay, great. Sage, and then Gwen.
One comment and one question about the firefighters. As I leaned in on that issue last year, I really learned that it was almost a pay class or philosophy, and I'd be curious to know how other cities handle this. As I understand, the issue was around hours away from family, hours sleeping at station, working 56 hours or 40 hours. I would love some clarity in the future about how other cities handle that.
Okay.
Most definitely, we'll get that.
Thank you. My question is, about the broader process here. So I see that we have this ideal option of doing everything the Archer study pointed out. I see we have this option 2 for a phased implementation. We have basically a 7.8 or a 4.9 you're bringing to us, and I'm wondering if is there an option 3, or is this where we're stopping and this is the recommendation today?
We are not making a recommendation today at all. This is what the report said. These are some options. We can come back with other options because they did include maybe one more option. But I think we were looking at these as, in terms of the most feasible for us to implement, considering, again, employee morale and all the pros and cons. But we will definitely bring that back to you. I think, unfortunately, that Archer added something kind of late in the game that we just didn't have, in terms of some options that we just didn't have enough time to assess and analyze in terms of one of the options. Oh, absolutely.
As we move through the budget process in time for this
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. It was just too late for us to add it on for this presentation.
So, here's what I would offer about these budget work sessions is that it is an opportunity for staff to hear kind of feedback from council in terms of broad directions. And that's so they can start cobbling together the budget. It is, it's a large living document that we eventually have to vote on. And so, as we drill down and the more meetings we have and the more community input we hear and feedback we receive, we refine it. But I think the purpose of these is not only to give us and the public all this information, but also for us to sort of give them broad indications about directions and maybe more questions and more, so that they can kind of go back and say, all right, this is what we heard. Based on that, we'll further expand this option, or we'll, whatever the case may be. It is very, very, very difficult for staff to make last-minute major changes to the budget. So it is really important that we don't wake up 2 weeks before the deadline and say, oh, I want to turn this on its head. That can happen, but it is not good for that to happen. And what you will find in this process is that very few people are probably watching this budget work session. And more people will become aware of the budget process as we go through it, and they will sort of be playing catch up. And then they will start giving you feedback. So you're kind of juggling a lot of different pieces and input, but just know turning on a dime is very difficult. And so it's good to give as much structure as you can as early as you can. That's all I'm gonna, because I know 4 of us have never done a budget before, a city budget before. So,
not that I have, this is Kim, and I'll just add.
I know, Kim, you've watched every meeting. And
since January of 2015, and these are the same questions as the past 6 years.
I get it. I'm just, now we're all sitting in this seat and it's go time. So I'm just, except for Kim, I'm just giving anyone who hasn't done it before just kind of a preview of how it intends to unfold. And that's kind of the Asheville phenomenon, I will say. I mean, in the past, the budget is like almost nobody would provide any comment, and it was, not, but that is not the case anymore. There's a lot of input we get around the budget, and so expect it to be a very robust process.
I think Gwen and Antoinette, whichever.
I'm just curious, and this is not a question. I'm wondering, because I haven't read the Archer report, I'm wondering if the numbers, the 4.9 million or the 7 point whatever, contemplated growing staff. I'm thinking since the city is growing by necessity, at some point the staff is going to have to grow. I'm wondering if that's been contemplated in any, okay.
No, ma'am.
No, just our existing 1,200 plus. Go ahead.
Just, and this is really probably more for the public, this whole compression issue that we're talking about is even more important in government, where everyone's salary is public information. Whereas when you work in a private corporation, you don't necessarily know what your boss makes or what your, coworker in another department makes, et cetera. This is very, salary is easily looked at, easily viewed. So we can't, not that a private company should ever do that either, but you just have to really remember that these employees see all this information, and so that's why it's even more important to be equitable and to consider all that, because it's very transparent to employees.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a very good point. First and foremost, again, thank you all. This was a lot that we presented. Mayor, I greatly appreciate you saying what you said in terms of why are we even having these work sessions. It really is to get direction from you all if there are some specific things that you want us to look at and pursue as we go through this budget process. What I hope that you got out of this information, though, is that we really are trying to address some issues related to how we deliver services, who is impacted mostly by the services that we deliver, and I hope no one takes away that we are trying to do way more for one group than we are another group. We aren't. We're trying to understand, have there been some inequities and adjust if there have been. But we value every person in our community, and we want to provide the highest quality and quantity of services that we can, that will enhance their lives or their businesses within our community. You all have a long day today. You have council meeting right after this, but we would be more than happy to stay on this call or have this conversation for as long as you all would like us to. If there are additional questions, we're happy to respond, or if there's any additional information you all want us to bring back, we would be happy to take that input right now. Otherwise, again, thank you, and we'll see you in 2 hours.
Is there, as we close out, I just want to give my appreciation to staff for putting this together. I know that this was a long-awaited report regarding staffing and salaries. I do feel that it will be very important to try to address these salary gaps to the greatest extent possible. We did just see that our general fund budget's in the 130-ish million range, and 7.8 million is a considerable amount when you're looking at a budget that size. But I do feel that it is not acceptable for us to be so non-competitive as compared to other employers, other cities, really, that is, in this situation. So. So I'm glad we have that information before us at this point. Here we are in March, so that's very helpful. Anyone have any? We are about to have a council meeting in 2 hours, but any other comments?
Yeah, I have to. This is Kim. I'm just going to try to make sure that I say this as consistently the same way for every budget work session, because there are so many people that don't have an opportunity to speak up. And so the narrative that we shouldn't wait until the last minute, but we always wait until the last minute for the public to engage. So I'm glad that we're finding new ways to do public input on this. But we have overlapping emergencies right now. We have a stated climate emergency. We have the COVID-19 pandemic. We have the crisis of racial inequity in our city and systemic oppression. And so I don't think this is going to be the time for business as usual, but I'm very confident that our community is capable of letting us know what healing looks like. And I'm glad to do this work with y'all, even when it's hard.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we're going to adjourn from this work session, and we'll see you all back on this screen at 5 o'clock for City Council.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.